Shabbat Shalom. A few moments ago we read in the Torah the prophet Isaiah crying out from the heart, Ad matai, how much longer? How much longer will the Jewish people suffer? How much longer will this world be a place of suffering? And I sometimes have the feeling that the world is a baby in our arms and the baby is running a fever. And if I feel deeply concerned about this, and if I wake up every day thinking about these kinds of issues, it's because of my teacher, Elie Wiesel of blessed memory. And if in spite of all these challenges and in spite of all these concerns, I feel a tremendous sense of hope and hopefulness, it's because of my teacher, Elie Wiesel. I met Professor Wiesel when I was 15 years old, and I remember the moment. It was at a lecture that he gave in New York at the 92nd Street Y. I remember the topic of the lecture, but nothing else because I was very nervous about meeting him. The lecture was on King Solomon. The lecture passed in a blur, and afterwards there was a small receiving room where you could wait in line and say hello to Elie Wiesel. This was in 1990, 4 years after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I was a 15-year-old high school kid, and I was quite intimidated. And I remember I took my place in line and waited and finally got to the front of the line, and Professor Wiesel held out his hand to me, and he looked me in the eye and he said, Elie Wiesel, as if I had no idea who he was. With tremendous modesty, and then with typical generosity, he said something else that I didn't realize at the time would change my life. He said, come and visit me and bring a question. Now, it took me about 7 or 8 months to build up what some people call the holy chutzpah to actually take him up on this offer. But I eventually did. I went to see him because I had so many questions as a young person. I was growing up in a very Orthodox environment. I was an artsy kid. I was drawing and painting all the time. I had a lot of questions about the relationship between Judaism and art that weren't being answered in the Orthodox setting in which I was growing up. I also have an older sister who's blind, and I had many questions about meaning and inclusiveness of Jewish community. And so I went to see Professor Wiesel, and I asked him my questions. And this started a series of conversations and visits. And I noticed something fairly quickly. I noticed that he never answered a single question I asked. Instead, he would respond to my questions with another question or sometimes a story. But I realized that this was more important and more helpful to me than had he answered my questions, because his questions were much better than mine. They were so sharp, they were so clarifying, they were so empowering. And over the coming years, I was to learn that the power of a question to awaken a young mind is beyond our measure. A few years later, I enrolled at Boston University, where Elie Wiesel taught for almost 40 years. You may know this, he lived in New York City, but he flew to Boston every week to teach. He stayed overnight, he taught Mondays and Tuesdays, and then flew back. Unless he was flying to Paris or Oslo or Jerusalem, he would still come to class. I heard that one time in the late 80s, he had to miss a class because he was at a United Nations conference in Paris, and so he had his assistant set up a speakerphone, and he called the class so that he could at least spend about 15 minutes with them at the beginning of the classroom meeting, and he apologized profusely for not being able to be there. He was an incredibly dedicated teacher, and I enrolled in his class as a sophomore in college with one singular ambition, which was to be ignored the entire semester. I was a very shy kid, and I sat in the corner and I really didn't want to speak up or be called upon, and I almost got away with it until the end of the semester when Professor Wiesel asked a question, and he looked at me, and he waited what seemed like a very, very long time. It was probably about 15 seconds, but that can seem like an eternity. And so I had no choice but to say the word that was on my mind in response to his question, and the word was authenticity. And he nodded and smiled and said, exactly, And a few weeks later, he asked me if I would be his teaching assistant the following year. So I always tell audiences and crowds and communities that if you ever are trying to raise money or convince someone to go out on a date with you or anything, just throw in the word authenticity. It works like magic. And that's how I felt. I really felt like this was a sort of magical moment. I didn't really understand why he was asking me. I felt not ready. And in fact, I turned down his offer. I turned down his offer and I wrote a letter to Professor Wiesel and I said, thank you so much. I'm really honored. I don't feel like I have enough to give yet. I need to go study more. And I'm going to Israel to study the sources, the deep roots of our own Jewish tradition, so that one day I'll have enough to give and maybe then we can revisit. And I called him up after I sent him that letter, and he answered the phone at home, and he said, I read your letter. I understand. I celebrate your decision to learn, to study. You know how much I care about studying. And then he said, I'll wait for you. And I really thought he was just being kind to a young student, but he meant it. And 7 years later, after I studied in Israel, I met with him, and he said, what are you doing after your smicha, after your ordination? And I said, I have this possibility here and another possibility there. And he said, why are you looking at any of those things? I told you I'd wait for you. So I became his teaching assistant then and spent the next 6 years in his classroom watching as he transformed the lives of students of many ages and many nationalities and backgrounds, and activated them, empowered them, lit a fire so that they left that classroom changed. They left that classroom committed to becoming witnesses and not spectators to the world. They left that classroom with a sense of moral responsibility. And I spent those years watching interactions between Professor Wiesel and the students, wondering, how is he doing this? So let me paint the picture for you to understand what was happening in this classroom. This was an academic classroom at Boston University, but it was also something of a yeshiva. It was sort of a traditional Jewish place of study in terms of the feeling of warmth. It was a multi-generational classroom. There were sophomores through, freshmen weren't allowed into the class, sophomores through graduate students and postgrad, and retirees who took courses not for credit. And so it was this multi-generational dialogue with a master educator. And the courses were all called, over 40 years, they were all headlined, Literature of Memory. Literature of Memory. We have to talk about why it was called Literature of Memory in a moment. And then each particular course had its own title. Literary responses to oppression, hidden and banned and censored books, authors in exile, tragedy in ancient and modern literature, a whole range of topics, none of which explicitly had anything to do with the Holocaust. And this is important because, surprisingly, Elie Wiesel taught exactly one class on the Holocaust in his entire career, and he never did it again. And I asked him why not, and he said, it's not my job to bring my students to despair. But of course, the memory of the Holocaust was so central to his life and work, and to his understanding of moral education and the needs of today, that he incorporated the message, the lessons of the Holocaust into everything else that he taught. But he did it obliquely, and he did it interspersed with great literature and great questions and a sense of joy and celebration. At the beginning of every class, he would give a small speech and he would say, my hope for you is that 25 years from now, you meet one another in an airport, and you say, didn't we sit together in a classroom in Boston and read Kafka together? That's my wish for you. And sometimes it happened that students became deep, lifelong friends through this classroom. Sometimes students met and got married. There's one couple I'm still in touch with who were in Elie Wiesel's class, and the young man had a profound crush on the young woman, but was too shy to say anything. He went to talk to Professor Wiesel. He said, what should I do? Professor Wiesel said, on the last day of class, leave a rose on her seat, on her desk, and you better do it fast because we're almost at the end of the semester. And he did, and they got married, and they have a big photograph of Professor Wiesel in their dining room. Their children know who their matchmaker was. Over the course of the period when I was meeting with him and asking him my questions, there was one question I did not ask him because it felt quite personal. And the question has to do with the end of the book Night. How many of you have read Night? So do you remember the very last moment in the book? Young Eliezer has been liberated from the camps. He's lost his mother, his little sister, and now his father. Do you remember the last scene? He looks in a mirror and he writes, "And a corpse was looking back, and I shall never forget the look on his face for as long as I live." That's the end of the book. And yet, the person I was getting to know was a person of great joy and a great sense of humor and a love of chocolate rugelach and a real sense of celebration. And I wanted to ask him, how did you go from that moment to the person you are today, a person of joy? Or another way of asking the question, what happened on the page after the last page of Night? Or a third way of asking the question, how do any of us transform suffering into joy and hope and positive motivation for positive action? How do we do that? I didn't ask the question, but when I was in Professor Wiesel's class, a student on the last day of class did ask the question. I was very grateful. She asked exactly this question. How did you go from the end, that moment of liberation, the end of Night, to being a person of joy and life, joie de vivre? How did you get there? And he said, if you ask me how I survived, I cannot tell you. I have no answer. I wasn't stronger than anyone else. I was very weak and frail. I got sick a lot. I didn't have connections in the camps like some people did. I didn't have any protectia, anyone looking out for me. And in fact, towards the end, I may even have not had very much reason to live. So I can't tell you how I survived. But if you're asking me how I kept my sanity after the war, that I can tell you. It was learning. It was learning that saved me and saved my sanity and my hope. And then he told us a story that I have since heard from other people who were there, that a few days after liberation, the adults, the members of the international rescue committees and the American military gathered all the orphans of Buchenwald. They were age 7 to age 19 or so. They gathered them together to give them medical attention, food, and to figure out where they're going to send them to orphanages. They were sent eventually to France and Switzerland to orphanages, but for a little bit of time, it wasn't clear where they were going to go. And they asked the children and the teenagers, is there anything we can give you while you're recovering from this unimaginable experience? Is there anything we can give you that will help? Professor Wiesel told us, I remember a young woman asked for chocolate because she wanted to see if she remembered the taste of chocolate from before the war. And he said, I remember a young man, a boy, asked for a sweater because he hadn't been warm for 4 years. But I asked, he said, for the same volume of Talmud that I was studying before the war, the great compendium of rabbinic lore and law. I asked for the same volume of Talmud so that I could pick up my studies at the exact same line, the exact same word where my studies were interrupted by the Nazi invasion of my town. And they got him a Talmud, and he returned to his studies. And even though his faith was shattered and broken, he returned to study and the celebration of study, and this is what saved him. And he taught us a very profound lesson in that moment, which is that learning is not just about information. Learning can have a transformative effect for all of us, and it can be the engine for transforming suffering into hope. And I, as a young person, heard this story, and I saw this man who had been through hell and was a person of great joy, and I thought, if he can do it, I have no excuse ever to give up. And so many survivors chose hope and chose life and built synagogues and communities and businesses and families. Who are we to give up on the world if they did not? This was the motivation for Professor Riesel's teaching. It was a faith in the future, and in his teaching, he emphasized several themes. He returned to several themes over and over again across the 40 years of his teaching. I want to just share a few of them right now to give you a taste of the kinds of lessons that he left us that I think are still very relevant today. Number one, the role of memory. Memory is the path to redemption, and forgetting is the path to exile. This is a Hasidic teaching from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, a teaching Professor Riesel loved. And when he said the word memory, you heard the capital M in the word. It was a sacred word for him. It was not just the transmission of information, although I have to say that information and facts themselves are an endangered species nowadays. We have to defend the memory of the past. We have to defend history and the teaching of history, particularly the teaching of the Holocaust, because it has such powerful universal lessons for today. And we know from study after study that young people in particular do not remember. One study from a few years back showed us that 66% of millennials could not identify the word Auschwitz. 66%. And 23% could not describe or define what the Holocaust was. We've seen videos of people going to Ivy League campuses and asking questions about the Holocaust, asking students, where did it happen, when did it happen, and getting answers like, 700 years ago? We have a lot of work to do just on that level. But memory with a capital M means something deeper than that. For Professor Riesel, it meant the sacred encounter with stories that change us. Stories that really profoundly move us, break our hearts open, change our minds about something, change our nervous systems, such that we can no longer be insensitive to other people's suffering. So I ask you just to take a moment and think, who is a person whose story you carry? A parent, a grandparent, a teacher, a mentor, a survivor you may know or knew or heard speak, a hero, someone who practiced an astonishing level of compassion. What's a story that you carry that sits on your shoulder, that knocks on the doors of your heart and reminds you, we have to do more? Just take a moment and think of that person, that story. Second, Professor Riesel was obsessed with the theme of faith and struggled with faith a lot, for obvious reasons. But we have to understand that he grew up as a deeply religious kid, a dreamy kid who said he knew the streets of Jerusalem better than he knew the streets of his hometown in Hungary or Transylvania. He spent time when the other kids were outside playing ball, reciting psalms and yearning for the Messiah to come and redeem the world. He was a very deeply spiritual kid, and the Holocaust shattered his faith. And he spent years trying to understand, how can I make sense of my relationship with God, a God whom I will not give up on no matter what, but a God whom I can no longer accept in the terms of my childhood, of my youth, a God who allows terrible suffering to happen. And he created a pathway in faith that transcends the usual categories. What's the opposite of faith? What is it? Louder? Despair. Wonderful. Often people say the opposite of faith is doubt, but the true answer is despair. The opposite of faith is not doubt, because you can have doubt and faith together. You can bring your doubts and your questions and your challenges into your faith, into your religious life, into your dialogue with God. This is a message that young people are often surprised to hear. In Professor Riesel's classroom, Christian ministry students were the most surprised to hear, especially Protestant Christian students. You can question God, you can argue with God. Well, yes, we have a tradition of that. It starts with Abraham. It begins with Abraham arguing with God on behalf of other people, other wicked people, in fact, the wicked people of Sodom. It continues with Moshe arguing with God on behalf of the Jewish people and saying, God, if you don't forgive the people, erase me from your book. The message of Judaism and the message of Jewish faith is we stand up for humanity even against God, and that is an expression of faith. Third, Professor Wiesel was obsessed with language. He was a person who was so sensitive to language, and his sensitivity was contagious, that he taught us that certain words have new meaning after the events of the Holocaust, and when you hear those words, you should tremble. Words like selection no longer mean what they meant before. Words like collaborate, it's a word that comes up in workplaces all the time. In an innocent sense, we're going to collaborate on a project. I can't hear that word without trembling now. I don't tell people not to use it. I don't want to impose that on others, but I personally tremble when I hear that word. And other words, fire, oven, there are words that we can no longer hear in the same way. And the biggest challenge of all in language, and the biggest challenge for Professor Wiesel as a writer, as a witness to the Holocaust, was how are we going to tell this story? When he survived, when he was liberated, he knew that he had an obligation to bear witness, as many survivors did, but he also knew that there is absolutely no way to convey the depth of the experience that he went through in the camps in words. There's no way, it's impossible. He was once sitting with a good friend of his who went through the camps with him, and they were sharing stories about what they saw, what they experienced firsthand in the camps. And Elie Wiesel said to his friend, Menashe, do you believe that happened? And Rabbi Menashe Klein, his friend, said, I was there, I saw it with my own eyes, and no, I don't believe it happened. So if an eyewitness can't believe it, how are we supposed to believe it? How are we supposed to transmit it to others? How are we supposed to stop denial? And so Elie Wiesel took an oath that for 10 years he wouldn't write about the Holocaust. And he spent 10 years in silence before writing Night. But the book that became Night, you may know, began as a book that was in Yiddish with a different title, and the world was silent. And the book was 96 pages long, something like that. And over the next year and a half, he cut the book back and edited it down to the book that we have, Night, which is about 111, 112 pages. And I asked him about that process of writing. And I'm a painter, and Professor Wiesel said to me, Ariel, writing for me is not like painting. When you paint, you add layers of paint to a canvas or other materials, and you build up the layers. Writing for me is not like that. Writing for me is like sculpture, where the sculptor imagines the image hiding within the block of marble, and then removes all the excess to reveal it. Writing for me is a process of subtraction. I had to write a bigger book and then subtract from it to create the essence of the book that you have. And do you think that the words that I removed are not there? They are there, you can feel them. You can feel the words that were taken away, and this is part of the power of the book Night. In the same way that the people we lost are still with us, those souls are with us and define our reality to this day, and if we pay attention, we can feel them. Don't think, though, that this classroom, even though it was dealing with such profound issues, was a place of sobriety and seriousness only. There was a tremendous emotional range. Professor Wiesel was very funny and very joyful. When a person asked a good question, he would say, A+, right away. And then he would turn to me, because I was the teaching assistant who had to enter all the grades, and he would say, A+. And I would talk to him after class and say, did you mean it? And he would say, well, let's see how he does on the final paper. And of course, Professor Wiesel was also an activist and a confidant of presidents and prime ministers. And so he would tell us about those moments. He once asked, before I was there with him, I heard this from other students, he once asked his students, I'm going to meet with Gorbachev, what should we talk about? And he came back the next week and reported on his conversation with Gorbachev. He brought some of the questions from the students to Gorbachev. Students would ask him, what's it like, Professor, to be in the White House? And he would say, I always leave the White House hungry. And students would say, why? And he would say, well, they order kosher food for me, which is very nice. But when I'm sitting and speaking with the president, so when I'm speaking, I can't be eating. And when the president is speaking, how can I eat? So I never eat, and I always leave hungry. But then he would also add, when I'm there, when I'm speaking to the President of the United States or someone else in a position of power, I think how strange Jewish history is. That a young boy from a small town called Siget in Transylvania, a yeshiva bacher, someone who was involved with study of Torah and prayer, should be sitting here talking about American policy about Yugoslavia or Rwanda or Darfur. What a strange sense of humor Jewish history has. And he would tell us that he thinks of his parents in those moments as well. And that when he had a difficult decision to make, he would ask, what would my mother do? But when he had a difficult decision to make that related to a communal issue, he would ask, what would my father do? Because his father was involved in communal issues. There were many other themes, many other topics, but there were three primary questions I want to share with you that Professor Wiesel taught us and did more than teach us, really inspired us to live with for the rest of our lives. Three questions. One is, where is God? To always ask, where is God? Where is the divine? Where is the transcendence? Number two, very important, where is Mephistopheles? Where is the devil hiding? Because Professor Wiesel would teach us, what is worse than evil? What is worse than evil is evil wearing a mask. And our first duty is to unmask evil and to name things accurately. So always ask, what is hiding behind the mask? Is there an agenda? Is there someone who wants to dehumanize another group of people speaking from behind the mask? And third, most importantly, what are you going to do with the world that you are holding in your hands? That's the most important question that Professor Wiesel asked us, his students, his readers, all of us. What are we going to do to make the world a little bit better? In my last meeting with Professor Wiesel, after many, many conversations and some study of Torah together and many questions that went unanswered, it was 3 weeks before he passed away. And we had a conversation that lasted a little over an hour that is still echoing in my mind and my heart. And at the end of that conversation, Professor Wiesel was in a wheelchair. He was very frail. And it was time for me to leave. And so usually, when we first met, we would shake hands at the end of our meetings. At a certain point, we started to hug at the end of our meetings, and that happened because of music. This is a beautifully musical shul, and you see how music can open our hearts. So there was once a moment where I had a meeting with Professor Wiesel, and I had just come back from a Jewish choral music festival. My father's a composer, and I was talking about this piece of music that my father wrote, and Professor Wiesel asked me, how does it go? So I sang just a few bars of this song, and he was so moved by the music that he came out from behind his desk and gave me a hug. And from then on, we hugged. Professor Wiesel was very musical and very sensitive to music. So now, my last meeting with him, he's in a wheelchair, it's time to go. Usually I would hug him, but he's so frail, and I'm afraid of hurting him or moving the wheelchair in a way that would be uncomfortable. And so I kind of held out my hand to hold his hand, and he pulled me down and kissed me on the cheek, and then he said, one more, and kissed me on the other cheek. And those were the last words I heard from him. And we know from our tradition that last words are meaningful. And I think a lot about this message, one more, what does it mean? And the way I understand it is that in a world that confronts us with so many challenges, it's easy to get overwhelmed. We have a lot of work to do to fight anti-Semitism. We have a lot of work to do to bring this country and society to a place of true racial justice and economic justice. There are a lot of people hurting around the world, in Turkey and Syria and elsewhere. There's violence and war. It's overwhelming. But our job is to look for one more action, one more moment of connection, one more phone call to connect with someone who's isolated, one more idea about a program that might make a difference, one more question that we can celebrate together. And through those one more moments, we can be blessed to see a difference in the world slowly over time. This is a vision that Professor Wiesel had and never gave up on. And I want to end by sharing one more moment in the classroom to return to where we began, the role of learning, the role of memory in transforming the world. So you remember there was a young woman who asked a question in the beginning. At the end of his lecture, I shared with you, she asked a question about the end of night. That took place on the last day of class, the last day of the semester, because the last day of the semester was always dedicated to a kind of open forum where students could ask anything. So the floor was open to questions, and students would ask questions about political realities. That year there were many questions about the Iranian nuclear program. There were questions about Israel and the Palestinians. There were questions about all kinds of issues. And then, this is in 2007, one student sitting in the front row raised his hand and sheepishly asked, "Professor, could you show us the number on your arm?" And there was a moment of deep silence. And without a word, Professor Wiesel took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeve, and turned so that everyone could see the number, the tattoo he received at Auschwitz. He rolled down his sleeve and buttoned it in silence and put his jacket on again and said, "Next question." And I thought about this for a long time because I knew that he was shy about showing people the tattoo on his arm. Why did he do it? He did it because he believed, as he said very often, that listening to a witness makes you a witness. And as we have fewer and fewer eyewitnesses to the Holocaust with us, fewer and fewer survivors and rescuers, we become the witnesses to the witnesses. It's our responsibility to keep that memory alive and to transmit it to the next generation, not only as a particular story of something that happened to a particular people in a particular place in time, which it is, but also as the source of utmost clarity about moral questions and issues. When we study the Holocaust, we learn where not to go. We learn what the warning signs are. We learn that those warning signs appear in subtle forms and we have to fight them quickly and aggressively. Listening to a witness makes you a witness. And I have to tell you that that year there was a Holocaust denier who claimed that Elie Wiesel didn't have a tattoo on his arm and wrote letters to the Boston University faculty and administration. And he designated each of these 65 or 70 students now to be deputies, witnesses, to be able to stand up and say, "I was there and I saw it." And I'm saying to you, I was there and I saw it. And our job is to stand up and speak what we've seen. And in so doing, to bring memory, celebration, compassion to this world that needs it so badly. Shabbat Shalom.